Moving into a new apartment always brought me mixed feelings. On one hand, it was a symbol of a new beginning, a chance to leave behind all failures and disappointments. On the other, the unknown was more frightening than joyful. The apartment on the fourth floor of an old panel building in a residential area seemed like the perfect option after my divorce from Marina. The price was acceptable, and most importantly, it was far enough from our old family nest not to run into familiar faces or recall what I wanted to forget. The first few days passed in the usual hustle and bustle of unpacking, arranging furniture, and trying to make an empty space feel like home. My job as a programmer at a small IT company allowed me to work remotely, which was especially convenient during this adaptation period. Sitting at my computer in my new living room, I could observe the life of the courtyard through the window, studying the neighbors and their habits. Opposite my building entrance was a playground where toddlers played during the day and teenagers gathered in the evenings. Their laughter and shouts created background noise that, strangely enough, calmed me and drowned out intrusive thoughts about the past. It was on one of those evenings that I first noticed him. A middle-aged man, tall and thin with dark hair and a pale face, stood on the balcony of the apartment opposite. He wasn't smoking, talking on the phone, or watering plants. He just stood there, looking in my direction. When our eyes met, he nodded slightly, and I instinctively nodded back. It was a polite greeting between neighbors, nothing special. But something in his gaze made me feel slightly uncomfortable, as if he was studying me too intently. In the following days, I started noticing him more often. He appeared on his balcony at various times. In the morning when I drank coffee, in the afternoon when I took a break from work, in the evening when I cooked dinner. Each time our eyes met, and each time he nodded with that same slightly strained smile. I began to feel a strange sensation, as if I was being watched, not intrusively, not aggressively, but constantly. Like a surveillance camera recording every movement. Work had become particularly stressful lately. Our company had received a large order to develop a warehouse management system, and the deadline was approaching at an alarming speed. I spent 12 hours a day at my computer, debugging code, fixing errors, and adding new features. My eyes ached from the constant strain, my back ached from sitting, and my thoughts blurred from exhaustion. In such moments, the loneliness felt particularly acute. Marina, despite all our disagreements, had always known how to support me in difficult times. Now there was no one to complain to about a hard day or simply to hug after a strenuous work session. It was on one of those exhausted evenings that I decided to go outside into the courtyard for some fresh air. It was already dark. The streetlights cast dim circles of light on the asphalt, and most of the windows in the buildings glowed with homely warmth. I slowly walked around the perimeter of the courtyard, enjoying the coolness and silence. Suddenly, I felt someone watching me. Turning around, I saw the familiar figure on the balcony. My silent neighbor stood in his usual pose, but in the darkness his face seemed even paler and more detached. I raised my hand in a greeting gesture, but he didn't respond. He just stood there and watched. The discomfort I had felt earlier escalated into overt unease. Something about his stillness, about how he observed me in the darkness, seemed unnatural. I hurried back into the entrance, but the sensation of being watched from behind didn't leave me, even in the elevator. For the next few days, I tried to ignore the balcony opposite, but the temptation was too strong. Every time I approached the window, I involuntarily searched for the familiar figure, and it was always there. In the morning when I had breakfast, in the afternoon when I worked, in the evening when I had dinner. It seemed as if he wasn't sleeping, eating, or doing anything, just standing and watching. My colleagues at work began to notice that I had become more distracted and nervous. During one video conference, I caught myself constantly getting sidetracked and glancing towards the window. Curiosity overcame caution. I decided to learn more about my mysterious neighbor. The concierge in my building, an elderly woman named Galina Petrovna, was a true living encyclopedia of all local gossip and news. She knew every resident by face, remembered who moved when, who argued with whom, and who bought what at the store. I decided to ask her for information, finding a suitable pretext. Claiming I wanted to inquire about the internet provider in the building opposite, I struck up a conversation with Galina Petrovna. She readily shared that a new resident had recently appeared in the building opposite. A middle-aged man lives alone, works at night, judging by the fact that the lights in his apartment were on all night. But the most interesting thing was that he never spoke to anyone. Galina Petrovna had seen him communicating with shopkeepers exclusively through gestures and nods. Some neighbors thought he was deaf-mute, others simply strange. This information didn't calm me. On the contrary, it intensified my unease. A person who didn't say a word, who worked nights and constantly watched my windows, seemed increasingly mysterious and unsettling. I started noticing other oddities. For example, when I came home from the store with bags, he always appeared on the balcony precisely at the moment I exited my building. When I left for work at the office, he watched me until I turned the corner. When I returned home, he was already at his post. Work on the project was nearing completion, but the stress didn't decrease. The client constantly demanded changes that had to be implemented at the last minute. I spent sleepless nights fixing code and testing new features. Exhaustion accumulated, and I began to notice that my perception of reality was becoming distorted. Sometimes it seemed that the neighbor was watching me not only during the day but also at night. Even when I worked with the curtains closed, I felt his presence. One night, while programming a particularly complex search function, I decided to take a break and have some tea. It was around 3 in the morning and the courtyard was completely silent. I pulled back the curtain and looked at the balcony opposite. No one was there. For the first time in several weeks, the balcony was empty. For some reason, this didn't make me happy. Instead, it made me feel even more uneasy. Where was he? What was he doing? Why wasn't he in his usual spot? I tried to focus on my work, but my thoughts kept returning to the empty balcony. In the morning, I woke up with a headache and a feeling that the past night had been filled with strange dreams. In my dream, I saw the pale face of the neighbor, his motionless figure and his intense gaze. He wasn't on the balcony, but somewhere nearby, very close. I remembered his smile, wide and unnatural, as if stretched by force. After waking, it took me a while to understand where the dream ended and reality began. Dizziness and weakness forced me to stay home and take sick leave. I spent the entire day in bed trying to regain my strength. Periodically, I got up to drink water or eat something light. Each time I passed the window, I instinctively glanced at the balcony opposite. The neighbor had returned to his spot and was watching again. His presence, which had previously only bothered me, now seemed frankly sinister. I began to wonder if I was watching him as obsessively as he was watching me. Perhaps it was mutual observation, a strange game we had both become involved in against our will. By the end of the week, my condition had noticeably worsened. The constant feeling of being watched began to seriously affect my ability to concentrate. Even simple tasks that I used to perform automatically now required significant effort. I started avoiding the window unnecessarily, but this only intensified my anxiety. The knowledge that he was there on his balcony looking at my windows haunted me even when I was in the farthest room. Sleep became shallow and interrupted. I would wake up in the middle of the night with the sensation that someone was watching me, and each time I was forced to check if the curtains were closed. The work project was finally completed, but instead of relief, I felt emptiness. The lack of constant occupation gave my mind more time for anxious thoughts. I began to analyze my neighbor's behavior, trying to find some pattern in it. In the morning, he would appear on the balcony around 7 a.m., precisely when I usually had breakfast. In the afternoon, he would disappear for several hours, probably sleeping or doing chores. In the evening, as dusk fell, he would return to his post and remain there until late at night. Sometimes I would wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning and see his silhouette, motionless and silent like a statue. Attempts to explain this behavior yielded no results. Perhaps he really worked nights, as the concierge suggested, and the balcony was his only place to get some fresh air. Or was he suffering from insomnia, simply passing the time by observing the courtyard's life? But why then was his gaze always directed specifically at my windows? Why did he never look in other directions, never take an interest in other neighbors? I decided to conduct an experiment. For several days in a row, I disrupted my usual routine. I had breakfast at different times, worked in different rooms, and even left the house at unpredictable hours. But each time I appeared at the window, I found him on the balcony. It was as if he somehow knew when I would look his way. This observation sent a chill down my spine. Either he spent much more time on the balcony than I thought, or he was truly watching me in some way. The idea that I might be bugged or monitored through some technical means seemed absurd, but I decided to check the apartment anyway. I thoroughly inspected all the rooms, especially places where cameras or microphones could theoretically be hidden. I checked my phone for suspicious apps, changed passwords for all my accounts. I couldn't find anything suspicious, but the paranoia didn't subside. I even taped over the webcam on my laptop, although I knew it wouldn't help against observation from the balcony. My social contacts after the divorce had dwindled to a minimum. Most of the friends I shared with Marina stayed with her, which was quite natural. Colleagues at work communicated mostly in a professional context, and I didn't feel like confiding in them about my personal problems. My parents lived in another city, and our phone conversations were limited to polite inquiries about health and work. As a result, I had no one to share my concerns about the strange neighbor with. Loneliness intensified the anxiety. When there are no close people around, small fears and suspicions tend to escalate into full-blown phobias. I started keeping a diary, recording the time the neighbor appeared on the balcony, the duration of his observation, and peculiarities of his behavior. Rereading these entries, I understood that from an outsider's perspective, they might seem like a paranoid delusion, but they helped me feel more protected, even if it was an illusion. One morning, while reviewing my week's entries, I discovered an interesting pattern. The neighbor appeared on the balcony not just at random moments, but precisely when I was experiencing particularly strong emotions. When I was angry at a client, when I was frustrated by a bug in the code, when I remembered Marina and felt longing. It was as if he somehow sensed my emotional state and reacted to it. This thought seemed so absurd that I even laughed. But the laughter quickly turned into a new wave of anxiety. Sleep problems worsened. I started taking melatonin, then stronger sleeping pills, but they helped little. Dreams became more vivid and intrusive. Almost every night I dreamt of the neighbor. Sometimes he stood on his balcony, but this balcony was not opposite my window, but right in my room. Sometimes he walked around my apartment, moving silently from room to room. His face in dreams was even paler, almost transparent, and his eyes seemed like black voids. But the most terrifying thing was that he smiled, a wide, unnatural smile that stretched from ear to ear. Waking up from such dreams, it took me a long time to understand where the dream ended and reality began. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my temples. I would get up, turn on the light, go around the entire apartment, checking the locks and making sure I was alone. Only then could I calm down a little. But the knowledge that it would all happen again in a few hours gave me no peace. I decided to see a doctor. The therapist, after listening to my complaints about insomnia and increased anxiety, suggested a course of antidepressants and advised me to find a hobby to distract myself. Of course, I didn't tell him about the neighbor. It would have sounded like madness. The pills did help improve my sleep somewhat, but during the day I felt sluggish and distracted. My work suffered, my concentration decreased, and I began to fear that I might lose clients. It was during this period that the first truly strange event occurred. In the evening, around 9 o'clock, I was working at my computer in the living room with the lights on. Suddenly, the electricity went out. Not just in my apartment, but in the entire building. I saw that my neighbor's windows were also plunged into darkness. A power outage was not uncommon in our old neighborhood, so I didn't pay much attention to it. I found a flashlight on my phone and started looking for candles. When I lit the first candle and placed it on the windowsill, I automatically glanced at the neighbor's balcony. What I saw made me freeze. The neighbor stood in his usual spot, but unlike all the other windows, his balcony was illuminated. Not by electric light, that was off everywhere, by some other softer and more diffused glow which seemed to emanate from him. In this unnatural light, his figure appeared even thinner and more elongated, and his face completely white. I rubbed my eyes, thinking it was a hallucination from fatigue, but the glow didn't disappear. Moreover, the neighbor raised his hand and waved at me. Slowly, as if underwater. I instinctively waved back, then abruptly pulled my hand away, realizing the absurdity of the situation. The electricity came back on after half an hour, but for the rest of the evening I couldn't get the image of the glowing neighbor out of my head. The next few days passed relatively calmly. The neighbor appeared on the balcony at his usual times, behaved as always. I even started to think that the vision during the power outage was a result of stress and medication. But the calm turned out to be deceptive. The true strangeness was just beginning. The first alarming sign was the sounds. At night, when the building became completely quiet, I began to hear footsteps in the stairwell. Not the usual footsteps of residents returning home or leaving early in the morning, but slow, measured steps that ascended the stairs and stopped on my floor. I would go out to the landing, but no one was there. The concierge, when I asked her, said that it was quiet in the stairwell at night. No one walked around. Then problems with electronics began. My computer would periodically freeze for no apparent reason. My phone's battery drained faster than usual. The TV would turn on by itself, usually on channels with static. I called a technician, but he found no malfunctions. He said that the problem might be with the house's wiring, but other residents weren't experiencing similar issues. The strangest thing was that all these anomalies occurred precisely when I noticed the neighbor on the balcony. It was as if his presence somehow affected the electronics in my apartment. I knew it sounded absurd, but the correlation was too obvious to ignore. I even tried to find information online about people who could affect technology, but only found pseudoscientific articles about biofields and psychics. The state of constant tension began to take a toll on my physical health. Headaches appeared that wouldn't go away with regular painkillers. My appetite was almost completely gone, and I started losing a noticeable amount of weight. Friends and colleagues I communicated with via video calls began to comment on my appearance. They said I looked tired and unwell. I brushed it off, blaming it on a heavy workload, but deep down I knew the problem was much more serious. Attempts to distract myself from thoughts of the neighbor were fruitless. I joined a gym, started reading books I'd put off for months, even tried meditation. But wherever I was, whatever I did, the image of the pale man on the balcony never left me. He became a part of my consciousness, an obsession that was impossible to get rid of. The only place where I felt relatively calm was the bathroom. There were no windows facing the courtyard there, and I could relax knowing that the neighbor couldn't see me. I started spending more time there, taking long baths and just sitting on the closed toilet, enjoying rare moments of peace. But even there, I was haunted by the feeling that someone was walking around behind the wall in the next room. Even though I knew for sure that there was no one in the apartment, the thought of moving came to my mind more and more often. But where? And most importantly, would it help? Maybe the problem wasn't the neighbor, but myself? Perhaps the stress of the divorce and loneliness had led me to see threats where there were none? These doubts tore me apart from the inside. On one hand, I wanted to believe in a rational explanation for what was happening. On the other, the accumulated observations and strange coincidences were difficult to explain away as simple stress. The decision came unexpectedly. I decided to try to establish direct contact with the neighbor. If he was truly just a strange but harmless person, a conversation would help dispel my fears. If something was wrong, it was better to know for sure. I bought binoculars and began to observe him more closely, studying the details of his behavior, his facial expression, his gestures. What I saw through the binoculars made me doubt my own sanity. The neighbor wasn't just standing on the balcony, he was standing absolutely motionless, so motionless that I couldn't even see his chest moving when he breathed. His eyes were wide open and unblinking. His lips were set in a barely perceptible smile that never changed. He resembled a mannequin or a wax figure. But the most terrifying thing was that when I aimed the binoculars at his face, he slowly turned his head and looked directly at me, right into the binoculars' lens, as if he knew I was watching him. I recoiled from the window, dropping the binoculars. My heart pounded so hard I feared I would faint. When I dared to look at the balcony again a few minutes later, the neighbor was not there. For the first time in all my observations, he had left his post at an unusual time. I spent the rest of the day in a state of extreme tension, waiting for him to return. But the balcony remained empty until evening. The night passed in agonizing anticipation. Every rustle outside the window made me jump and listen intently. Sleep came in fits and starts, and each time I woke with the feeling that something in the surrounding space had shifted. The room seemed different, the air thicker, the shadows deeper. In the morning I felt broken, as if I hadn't slept at all but had been running from an invisible threat all night. The first thing I did after waking was glance at the balcony opposite. The neighbor was there, standing in his usual pose, looking in my direction. But something in his appearance had changed. He seemed closer. Not physically, the distance between our houses remained the same. But I felt his presence more acutely, as if he had moved not in space but in some other plane of existence. His gaze had become more penetrating, more intrusive. I realized that yesterday's observation with binoculars had been a mistake. I had somehow attracted his attention, and now the connection between us was even stronger. Working in such a state was impossible. I took another sick day and decided to dedicate it to trying to find a rational explanation for what was happening. Perhaps the neighbor truly suffered from some mental illness that made him behave strangely. Maybe he was taking medication that affected his behavior, or perhaps he had autism, and repetitive actions helped him cope with stress. I clung to any version that could explain what was happening without resorting to supernatural forces. But the more I thought about it, the less convincing the rational explanation seemed. The neighbor's stillness exceeded all imaginable limits. A person, even one suffering from severe mental disorders, cannot stand for hours without the slightest movement. Breathing, blinking, small changes in posture, these are natural physiological processes that cannot be fully controlled. And the neighbor was as still as a corpse. The thought of death made me flinch. What if what I was seeing on the balcony wasn't a living person? What if it was a corpse placed there by someone for a specific purpose? But who and why would do such a thing? And how to explain the fact that the corpse turned its head and reacted to my behavior? The absurdity of this version was obvious, but it wouldn't leave my mind. I decided to conduct another experiment. If the neighbor was truly connected to me in some way, he should react to my actions. I stood by the window, clearly visible from the balcony, and began to perform various movements. I raised my arms, squatted, walked from side to side. The neighbor didn't react. He stood motionless, looking directly at me. But when I closed my eyes and mentally addressed him, asked him to show a sign that he heard me, something strange happened. Suddenly, the apartment became cold. Not just cool, but truly cold, as if someone had opened a freezer. I felt goosebumps prickle my skin and my breath became visible. The temperature dropped about 10 degrees in a few seconds. I hurried to the window to check if it was open, but it was tightly closed. The thermometer showed a normal room temperature, but I continued to shiver. The cold lasted about a minute and then disappeared just as suddenly. The temperature returned to normal, but the feeling of something alien's presence in the apartment intensified. I realized I had received an answer to my mental question. The neighbor didn't just see me, he somehow sensed my thoughts and emotions. The connection between us was not physical but mental, or spiritual, or something else for which I had no name. For the next few days I tried to ignore the neighbor, not look in his direction, not think about him. But it was like trying not to think about a pink elephant. The more I tried to distract myself, the more intrusive the thoughts of him became. I felt his presence even with my eyes closed, even in rooms where the balcony wasn't visible. He became a part of my consciousness, an obsession that was impossible to shake. My physical condition continued to worsen. I barely ate, losing about 5 kilograms in a week. My skin took on an unhealthy gray tint and dark circles appeared under my eyes. Colleagues in video conferences started asking about my health, but I brushed them off, citing temporary difficulties. No one knew about my real problem, and I couldn't share it with anyone. Who would believe a story about a neighbor who could control the temperature in someone else's apartment with the power of thought? It was during this period that an event occurred that finally convinced me I was dealing with something supernatural. It was late evening, around 11. I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep when I heard sounds in the hallway. Someone was opening the front door with a key, slowly, carefully, trying not to make a sound. I froze, listening. The locks clicked, the door creaked on its hinges, and soft footsteps sounded down the hallway. My first impulse was to grab something heavy and prepare to defend myself. But fear paralyzed me. I lay in the dark, not daring to move, and listened as someone moved silently through my apartment. The footsteps were strange, too light for an adult, but too measured for a child, as if someone was walking, barely touching the floor. The sounds approached the bedroom. The door was closed, but I heard someone stop right behind it. There was absolute silence for a few seconds, and then the doorknob slowly turned. I squeezed my eyes shut, pretending to be asleep, but I felt a coldness seeping into the room. The same unnatural coldness I had felt during the day. Someone entered the bedroom. I heard barely discernible footsteps, felt the movement of air. The presence stopped beside the bed. I lay with my eyes closed, but I knew someone was looking at me, intently, without breaking away. The sensation of being watched was so strong that my skin crawled. Several minutes passed, or hours, I couldn't tell for sure. Time seemed to stop. Finally, I mustered the courage to open my eyes. No one was in the room, but the air still held traces of an alien presence, and on the floor by the bed I noticed wet marks. Not watery, something else, more viscous. I turned on the light and carefully examined the marks. They were small, human, but their shape seemed wrong, as if someone had walked barefoot, but their toes were longer than usual. I checked the front door. It was locked with all the bolts. The windows were also closed, no signs of forced entry, but the marks on the floor were real. I could touch them. They were cold and left a strange sensation on my fingers, as if I had touched something dead. I washed my hands with hot water and soap, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I spent the rest of the night in the living room armchair with all the lights on. Sleep wouldn't come. I thought about what had happened, trying to find a logical explanation. Perhaps it was a hallucination caused by stress and sleep deprivation. But the marks on the floor were real. I photographed them with my phone, measured them with a ruler, and even took a sample of the sticky substance in a glass jar. In the morning, the marks were gone. They had simply vanished, leaving no stains on the parquet. The photos remained, but they were blurry, as if the camera couldn't focus on the object. The sample in the jar had turned into ordinary water. I realized I was dealing with something that did not obey ordinary physical laws. The neighbor on the balcony stood as usual, but his posture seemed more relaxed, as if he had achieved some goal, taken an important step in realizing his plans. His smile became wider, although before I hadn't even been sure he was smiling. Now it was obvious. He was definitely smiling, broadly and contentedly. I realized I was in serious danger. Whatever my neighbor was, he was clearly not an ordinary human. He could enter my apartment, bypassing locks and obstacles. He could influence temperature and electronics. He could somehow read my thoughts or emotions. And now he had taken the next step, physically appearing in my home. I started looking for ways to protect myself. I researched paranormal phenomena online, how to protect oneself from evil spirits and entities. Most sources were clearly unreliable, but some advice seemed reasonable. I bought salt and sprinkled it at the threshold, acquired several icons and hung them in the bedroom, and even ordered special amulets online against the evil eye and spoilage. These measures provided temporary relief. For more than a week, the neighbor didn't appear in the apartment, although he continued to stand on the balcony. But I felt it was a temporary reprieve. He was studying my defenses, looking for ways to overcome them. Sometimes it seemed as if he was even laughing at my attempts to protect myself. His smile grew wider and his gaze became more mocking. The state of constant fear and anticipation began to affect my ability to think rationally. I started seeing threats everywhere. Every creak in the house, every shadow, every unexpected sound made me jump. I stopped leaving the house unless absolutely necessary, ordered groceries for delivery, and avoided contact with neighbors. The world outside the apartment seemed hostile and dangerous. Work completely stopped. I couldn't focus on the code, couldn't hold a normal meeting with colleagues. Clients started complaining about delays in order fulfillment. I understood that I was losing my source of income, but I couldn't help myself. The only thing that mattered was protection from the neighbor and trying to understand what he was and what he wanted from me. The answer came unexpectedly. One morning, while browsing local news online, I stumbled upon an article about a series of strange deaths in our area. Over the past month, 4 people had died, all from heart failure, all between 30 and 40 years old, all without apparent cause. Doctors couldn't explain the reason for the deaths. The people were relatively healthy, didn't suffer from heart disease, and weren't taking dangerous medications. But the most interesting thing was that all 4 lived in houses from whose windows the balcony of my neighbor was visible. I checked the addresses, found these houses on a map, even walked around the neighborhood to confirm. Indeed, from the windows of all these apartments there was a direct view of the balcony. The coincidence seemed too obvious to be accidental. I realized I was the next target. The neighbor wasn't just observing people, he was somehow affecting them, slowly undermining their health, driving them to death. 4 people had already fallen victim to him, and now it was my turn. The physical symptoms I had been experiencing for the past few weeks, weight loss, insomnia, headaches, were signs of the same effect that had killed my neighbors. The horror of this realization mingled with a strange relief. Finally, I knew what I was dealing with. This was not a figment of my imagination, not a result of stress or mental disorder. This was a real threat, a mortal danger that needed to be overcome somehow. But how to fight an entity that could kill at a distance, penetrate any barriers, and affect physical reality? I decided to act radically. If the neighbor fed on fear and negative emotions, then I had to deprive him of that sustenance. I started taking strong sedatives that dulled my emotions. I began meditating, trying to achieve a state of inner emptiness. I avoided looking towards the balcony, didn't think about the neighbor, focusing on neutral things, work, books, everyday tasks. The first few days of this tactic yielded positive results. My physical condition began to improve, my sleep became deeper, and my appetite partially returned. The neighbor on the balcony seemed less active. His smile was not as wide. Perhaps he was indeed weakening without the constant nourishment of my fear. But my relief was premature. The neighbor was simply changing tactics. If he couldn't affect me through emotions, he found other ways. more direct manifestations of his presence began. Objects in the apartment started moving on their own. First small things, pens, keys, glasses. Then larger ones, books, dishes, even furniture. In the morning, I might find all the chairs in the living room turned towards the window, all the knives in the kitchen pointing in one direction, all the mirrors covered with towels. These changes occurred at night while I slept. I set up a camera to capture the movement of objects, but the recordings only showed a static image. It was as if time stopped for several hours and then resumed. But the apartment's arrangement was already different. The neighbor had learned to affect not only space, but also time. The understanding that the neighbor could control time utterly shattered my belief in the possibility of resistance. If he could stop or slow down time, no defense would help. He could enter the apartment at any moment, do anything, and I wouldn't even know it. All that remained for me was to await the inevitable end and hope it would be swift. But the neighbor, it seemed, was in no hurry. He savored the process, drawing out the pleasure. Each day brought new manifestations of his presence, each more elaborate and terrifying. It was as if he was testing the limits of my sanity, seeing how far he could go before I completely broke. In the morning, I might wake to find all my photographs turned face to the wall, or that something illegible was written on the bathroom mirror, as if by a finger on steamy glass, yet the mirror was dry. Or that all the clocks in the apartment showed different times, some of them even running backward. These small but constant reminders of his presence slowly eroded my sanity. The nights were especially difficult. I stopped sleeping in the bedroom, moving to the living room, placing my mattress so I could see both the front door and the window simultaneously. But it didn't help. The neighbor had learned to penetrate my consciousness even through sleep. Dreams became so realistic that I couldn't distinguish them from reality. I saw him walking around the apartment, touching my things, standing at the head of my bed and watching me. Sometimes in my dreams he tried to say something, his lips moving but no sounds were heard. Only that eerie smile that grew wider and wider. Waking from such dreams, it took me a long time to understand where reality ended and the vision began. The apartment seemed altered, as if real events had occurred in my sleep. Sometimes I would find objects in the places I'd seen them in my dreams, or discover that something had changed precisely as it had in the dream. The line between sleep and wakefulness blurred, and I began to suspect that I was living in some intermediate state. My physical condition continued to worsen despite all my attempts to resist. My weight had dropped by 10 kilograms, my skin had a waxy pallor, and my hair began to fall out. I looked like a critically ill person, although doctors couldn't offer any diagnosis. My blood tests showed strange results: critically low iron levels, then vitamin deficiencies, then hormone problems. But no supplements or medications helped. I realized I was dying, slowly but inexorably. The neighbor was draining my life force day by day, hour by hour, like a vampire, only not blood, but the very essence of life. I felt an emptiness forming inside me, as if my soul was gradually leaving my body. My movements became slower, my thoughts cloudier, my emotions duller. The only thing that remained sharp was fear. Fear of what would happen when the process was complete. What would become of my consciousness when my body finally ceased to function? Would I simply disappear, or would I become part of the same dark force that was now devouring me? Would I turn into an entity like my neighbor, condemned to eternally stand on a balcony and hunt for new victims? These thoughts were so terrifying that I decided to try to interrupt the process myself. If death was inevitable, it was better to die quickly and by my own will than to allow this creature to finish the job. I took all the medications from my medicine cabinet, began researching information about lethal doses, about ways to painlessly end one's life. But even in this, the neighbor managed to thwart me. Every time I gathered the courage for a decisive step, something would happen. Medications would disappear or turn into harmless vitamins or simply not work. Knives became dull, ropes snapped, windows wouldn't open. It was as if he wouldn't let me die too quickly, wanting to prolong the agony as long as possible. During these days, I began to notice changes in the neighbor himself. He started to look more alive, more real. His complexion changed from deathly pale to almost normal. His movements became smoother, less mechanical. He even occasionally turned his head, following birds or cars in the courtyard with his gaze. It was as if, as I weakened, he grew stronger and more human. I realized he wasn't just killing, he was reincarnating. Each victim gave him not only energy but also a piece of humanity. Perhaps he himself was once an ordinary human but became a victim of a similar entity. And now he was continuing this cycle, turning others into what he had become. An eternal cycle of death and rebirth where each new victim becomes a hunter. This thought was so terrifying that I felt a final surge of resolve. If I couldn't die quickly, I would at least try to break this cycle. Not to let him complete the transformation, to prevent him from becoming fully human. Perhaps this would save future victims or at least postpone their fate. I began to actively resist. Not physically, I no longer had the strength for that, but mentally. Every time I felt his presence, I mentally pushed him away, envisioning a protective barrier of light around myself. When he tried to enter my dreams, I forced myself to wake up. When I started to feel the cold of his approach, I turned on all the heaters and forced myself to think of warm, sunny places. This resistance cost me dearly. Every act of will drained my last strength. Every attempt at defense brought me closer to physical death. But I felt that this struggle was not in vain. The neighbor became more aggressive, more desperate. His smile turned into a grimace of anger. His movements became sharp and nervous. He understood that I wouldn't let him calmly complete the process. The climax came after a week of this confrontation. I could barely stand, hardly ate, and slept in short bursts of a few minutes. But I continued to resist, and then one night he decided to end it once and for all. I woke to an intense cold in the room, far colder than before. The air had turned into an icy substance that was painful to breathe. I felt my skin beginning to frost. My breath became visible like in winter outdoors. But the most terrifying thing was, I saw him. The neighbor stood right in my room. Not on the balcony, not in the doorway, but right in the middle of the room. He was tall, even taller than he appeared from a distance. Extremely thin, like a skeleton covered in parchment skin. His face was absolutely white, without a trace of blood, and his eyes were completely black, without pupils or irises. A smile stretched from ear to ear, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. He slowly approached the bed. Each step was accompanied by a sound like the crackling of breaking ice. The air around him distorted, as if from extreme cold. I tried to get up, to run away, but my body wouldn't obey. The cold paralyzed my muscles, freezing my movements. I could only lie there and watch him approach. He stopped at the head of the bed and leaned over me. His face was very close. I could see every wrinkle on his waxy skin, every tooth in his gruesome smile. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but instead of words, a stream of icy air burst forth. The breath of death meant to finally freeze my soul, but at that moment I felt an unexpected surge of strength. Not physical, my body still wouldn't move, but spiritual. As if at the last moment help came from above, or I found a reserve within myself that I hadn't suspected. I focused on a single thought: not to let him win, not to become part of his curse, to die, but not to allow him to reincarnate. The neighbor felt my resistance and hissed like an enraged snake. His form began to waver, becoming less distinct. He tried to intensify the cold, to suck the last vestiges of life from me, but I held on. With my last ounces of strength, my last drops of will, I held on. The confrontation lasted several minutes, though it felt like an eternity. I felt my life ebbing away, my heart slowing, my breathing becoming shallower. But at the same time, I saw that the neighbor was also weakening. His form became more and more indistinct, the cold diminished, his malevolent smile twisting into a grimace of despair. Finally, he retreated. Slowly, reluctantly, but he retreated. His figure began to dissolve like smoke in the wind. Before disappearing, he looked at me one last time, and in his black eyes I saw not malice, but fear. Fear that his plan had failed, that he would not be able to complete the reincarnation. He vanished, but I knew it wasn't a victory. It was a Pyrrhic victory that cost me my life. I didn't let him become human, but I also couldn't survive. My heart beat slower and slower, my breathing became more and more difficult. I felt life leaving me, my consciousness fading. In my last moments, I thought about what could have been different. If I had moved immediately, not tried to understand what was happening. If I hadn't looked at the balcony, hadn't attracted his attention. If I hadn't been so curious and stubborn. But it was too late for regrets. I died at dawn, as the first rays of sun entered the room. Death was quiet and peaceful, without pain or torment. My consciousness simply faded slowly like a candle in the wind. The last thing I saw was the empty balcony opposite. The neighbor was no longer at his post. Perhaps he had disappeared forever, deprived of the ability to complete the transformation, or perhaps he had simply gone to find a new victim. My body was found a week later when neighbors complained about an unpleasant smell. The official cause of death was attributed to heart failure due to exhaustion. Doctors couldn't explain why a relatively young and healthy man died of starvation in his own apartment, surrounded by food and money. But their explanation no longer concerned me. Strangely, death turned out not to be an end, but the beginning of a new existence. I discovered that my consciousness persisted, albeit in an altered form. Now I could observe what was happening, but I couldn't influence events. I saw my body being taken away, my apartment being sealed, and new tenants moving into the vacated dwelling. And most importantly, I saw that the neighbor had not disappeared. He had simply moved. Now he stood on another balcony, observing the windows of another house. He was weaker than before, more transparent and less real. My resistance had indeed damaged him, taking away some of his accumulated power. But it hadn't destroyed him. Now he was hunting for a new victim. A young woman who had recently moved into an apartment with a view of his balcony. She hadn't yet noticed his intense scrutiny, but I saw him studying her daily routine, focusing on her emotions. The process was starting again. I tried to warn her, but I had no way to communicate with the living world. I could only watch as history repeated itself. How she began to notice the strange neighbor. How her anxiety grew. How her health deteriorated. The whole cycle anew, with a different victim. The understanding that my suffering and death had been in vain, that I couldn't stop this evil, became a true hell for me. Worse than physical torment was the inability to intervene, to change the course of events. I was condemned to eternally watch the neighbor kill one victim after another, gaining strength and approaching his goal. Perhaps someday he will truly manage to complete the transformation, become a full human and cease his hunt. Or perhaps someone stronger will be found who can stop him forever. But for now, I can only watch and remember that some neighbors are more dangerous than the most terrifying nightmares. My story is over. I wrote it in the hope that someday someone will read these lines and be more cautious with silent neighbors. Not every observation is harmless, and not every smile means friendliness. Sometimes behind an ordinary facade there hides something so ancient and malevolent that it's best not to attract its attention. But if you already have, resist to the end, even if it costs you your life.